There's a scene in Nora Ephron's 1993 film Sleepless in Seattle where Rita Wilson's character describes the 1957 film An Affair to Remember. She gets through the basics of the plot before absolutely dissolving into a flurry of tears.
Oh, goodness.
The reaction is a testament to the film as a whole and its writing, but if you've seen it, you also know that the film owes a great deal of its appeal to the charm of its leads.
Cary Grant and Deborah Kerr. Is it Kerr or Kerr?
Kerr.
It's Kerr, and in today's video, we're going to take a look at exactly why she is so compelling. Deborah Kerr has come up in passing a couple of times on this channel, and it's no wonder. Between 1948 and 1960, she earned 6 Best Actress nominations, so it was pretty much inevitable that we'd run into her here and there. But the reason she hasn't had her own video thus far is that she never actually won one, which until very recently was actually a record. As of the publication of this video, only Glenn Close, Richard Burton, and Peter O'Toole have more nominations without winning a competitive award. In 1994, the Academy attempted to remedy this situation with an honorary Oscar, but there's still something that feels a little unsettled or maybe even confusing about Deborah Kerr's record. After all, as Donald Chase wrote in Film Comment, she dominated American movies of the 50s as surely as, though more quietly than, the orthodox distaff trinity of Monroe, Taylor, and Audrey Hepburn. And if that's the case, and it is, then what on earth happened? Why is it that such a highly respected, popular, and relatively uncontroversial actress never got to bring home an award? And what does her story say about the film industry at large? In this video, we're going to dive deep into the career of Deborah Kerr to find out. We'll talk about her ladylike persona, why it's not quite as ladylike as you might think, the timing of her fame, and why she tends to be overlooked as a celebrity. This video will be the first in a new series I've affectionately titled Always Second Best Actress, which will take a look at the careers of women who were nominated multiple times for Best Actress, but for whatever reason never took home the award in a competitive race, and attempt to put their filmographies in the context of larger cultural and industry trends. Before we get started, I want to say thank you to NordPass for sponsoring this video. If you want an easy, secure way to make sure all of your online information stays safe, head on over to nordpass.com/bkindrewind via the link in my description and use the code bkindrewind to get 50% off a 2-year NordPass premium plan plus 4 months. At the end of this video, I'm going to tell you why this app has worked so well for me and exactly how it'll make your digital life so much easier, so be sure to stick around. Given the nominations I mentioned in the introduction of this video, it's easy to consider Deborah Kerr an actress emblematic of 1950s cinema. And that's true, she is, of course, but I think primarily focusing on her success in that era obscures both the timeline and a true range of her filmography. In reality, she rose to prominence a lot earlier than you might expect. Take, for example, this cover of Picture Post magazine. Under her name reads the headline, "Is This a New Star?" It was December 1940, she was just 19 years old, and she hadn't even been in a movie yet. It's not that the article was particularly prescient, it was just that obvious to everyone who met her, to everyone who was behind the scenes of her first films, that she was meant for movie stardom, and it was only a matter of time before audiences agreed. Trained both as a stage actress and a ballet dancer, she was recruited at almost first glance and signed to a long-term film contract by producer Gabriel Pascal, who wasted no time in finding a debut vehicle for her. That came in the form of Major Barbara in 1941, an adaptation of a George Bernard Shaw play in which an idealistic officer in the Salvation Army, played here by Wendy Hiller, confronts what she sees as hypocrisy when the organization's leaders accept money from her wealthy but immoral father. Deborah's role as Jenny Hill is small but crucial to the plot, and by that time, critics and other filmmakers had noticed her talent. She was quickly launched into a series of lead roles in critically acclaimed films including, but not insignificantly, Michael Powell and Emmerich Pressburger's The Life and Death of Colonel Blimp, in which she plays 3 different women who meet the titular Colonel Blimp across different eras of his life. It was that film that caught the attention of MGM's British division. Pretty soon, she was solidly on the radar of every American studio, and by 1945, most of them were vying to buy out her contract. MGM eventually won the day and signed her to an extremely lucrative contract. Even with just a few films under her belt, it's not difficult to see why these studios were so interested. I mean, most obviously, she looks like a movie star, with delicate features that could carry the Hollywood brand of heavy glamour, but absolutely didn't need to, and bright red hair that took to Powell and Pressburger's Technicolor really, really well. For studios looking to the future of filmmaking, and by extension, the proliferation of color technology, she had a look that they knew they'd want to take advantage of, and eventually did. Second, we have probably the most important thing about her range. Her British films showcase a level of diversity that wasn't necessarily afforded to her American counterparts. Her roles span various genres: historical dramas, spy thrillers, romance, comedy. She takes on various regional British accents, as well as Irish and Norwegian, and she defies stringent typecasting, playing not just devout women like Jenny Hill or Sister Claudia in Black Narcissus, but women like the wide-eyed working girl turned hardened mistress in Love on the Dole, and a resistance fighter in The Avengers. Sometimes her range was on display in just one film alone. Colonel Blimp is a great example, but so is Vacation from Marriage, in which she plays a shy, mousy wife who, over the course of her participation in World War II, blossoms into a confident, worldly woman. And third, she seemed like she could fit into a mold MGM already knew that they really liked. And by that I mean, they basically wanted Greer Garson, but younger. I feel like I'm always trying to get people to pay attention to Greer Garson on this channel. She's a remarkably charming actress who is vastly underrecognized these days. But as much as we fail to give her her due in 2021, that was not at all her problem in the 1940s. After making her American film debut in 1939, Garson went on to become one of the top box office draws of the decade. She earned 5 Best Actress nominations in a row, winning for Mrs. Miniver in 1942. But by the end of the decade, her relationship with MGM became more complicated. Not only had she turned 40, which for an actress is an uh-oh, but she also started to take a more active hand in shaping her career, which resulted in at least one very high-profile flop. She had insisted upon starring alongside Clark Gable in his first film after returning from combat in World War II, Adventure. MGM knew this was a bad idea. The two actors never gelled on screen or off. The film performed poorly, and Greer was ultimately and unfairly labeled difficult and shouldered the blame for it all. To industry insiders and choice gossip columnists, MGM's purchase of Deborah Kerr's contract read like a blatant attempt to phase Greer out of the studio's top echelon of stars, to the point that she was described as a threat to Greer's cinematic career. After all, she was a redhead, like Greer. She was English, like Greer. The studio emphasized her ladylike charm for the press, like Greer. And she was 17 years younger, almost to the literal day. Garson was also, of course, aware of this, and in a magazine piece that reads like it came straight out of MGM's publicity department, she poked fun at herself, acknowledged her error in pushing for Gable as a co-star, and positioned her and Deborah as friends who joked about all the fuss being made over their dynamic. To their credit, and to speak to some plausibility of this article, I haven't seen anything that would suggest they actually had a personal feud at all. Still, every move MGM made seemed to confirm that this was their intention. The studio rolled out the red carpet for Kerr, executing one of the most intensive publicity campaigns Hollywood had seen in years, solely to hype up this young actress. A Time magazine article announcing her arrival in Hollywood titled "A Star is Born" stated that it is clear that Deborah is well on her way to becoming, as quickly as possible, the brightest and best movie star that the biggest and most proficient star factory in the world can make of her. To guarantee audiences pronounced her name correctly, the tagline "Kerr rhymes with star" was plastered everywhere you could possibly imagine. Everywhere. A masterclass in subliminal messaging. You absolutely weren't going to miss the tagline, you weren't going to mispronounce her name, and you knew what you were supposed to think about her. Next, they arranged for her American film debut in The Hucksters alongside their biggest male asset, Who else but Clark Gable? As a side note, as if that weren't enough of a hint to Greer Garson, she was actually supposed to star in Deborah's next film, If Winter Comes, but was replaced. Instead, Carr got to co-star with Walter Pidgeon, Garson's most frequent collaborator. The Hucksters was a major moment for Deborah in the sense that it was her first film made specifically for American audiences. But a couple of factors made this film not feel like the big splashy debut it was intended to be. First, big splashy debuts are most effective when they successfully surface a relatively unknown entity. We'll talk about a big one in a minute. Had Deborah come out of nowhere and made an impression with critics for holding her own with a major star like Gable, the Hucksters might have seemed more surprising and exciting. But as we've discussed, Deborah had a full body of work that preceded her arrival. So by 1947, she was already pretty well known and highly respected by most critics. In fact, in 1946, she placed just behind Ingrid Bergman in Spellbound and Joan Crawford and Mildred Pierce for the New York Film Critics Circle Award for Best Actress for Colonel Blimp. In 1947, she won it for her performances in Black Narcissus and The Adventuress, beating the eventual Oscar winner Loretta Young. She even made an appearance at the 1947 Academy Awards months earlier, where she accepted the award for Clemence Dane, who won Best Original Story for Vacation from Marriage. The spotlight of Hollywood was turned full upon her, one paper said about her appearance. It was obvious Deborah Kerr had won the respect and deep admiration of her fellow workers. So despite MGM's massive publicity push, instead of bursting onto the American scene, she kind of trickled in. This leads us to the second reason, which is that these films definitely read like tests. They aren't really meant to challenge Deborah or showcase her skills in any meaningful way. Instead, they're more of a safe landing ground, meant to work out her persona and signal where MGM saw her fitting in among her stable of stars. Like Garson, MGM didn't see her as a sex symbol, a working girl, or a villain, and made efforts to highlight that by carefully choosing her supporting cast. Emphasize her class in The Hucksters by contrasting her with club singer Ava Gardner. Emphasize her sweetness in If Winter Comes by pitting her against the cold, dispassionate Angela Lansbury, who was still in her bitchy character era. The problem here is, again, that she had a full body of work to compare these films to. The Hucksters did well at the box office, but it wasn't well reviewed generally. And I mean, let's be honest, can you blame critics and audiences for feeling underwhelmed with the Hucksters when they had just seen Deborah in Black Narcissus? That feeling didn't end there. As one critic bluntly wrote in his review of If Winter Comes, Kerr again fails to live up to the promise she showed in her British efforts. Thankfully, those films were followed by perhaps her greatest role of the MGM years, Evelyn Bolt in Edward, My Son. Finally, she was given a real chance to exercise her emotional range as she portrayed Evelyn's dramatic shift in demeanor. She begins as an excited new mother, but is worn down into a jaded alcoholic, stuck in a spiral of loathing for a family she can't control. She received glowing reviews, especially for her scenes later in the movie, and eventually received her first Oscar nomination. And the narrative is somewhat compelling. A British actress makes good on MGM's promise to deliver a new major star, but the hype just wasn't there. It was there for Olivia de Havilland, who delivered a career best in The Heiress. Still, MGM had a ton of faith in the potential of Deborah's stardom and involved her in many high-stakes projects as the studio increasingly focused on Technicolor spectacles in order to compete with television. King Solomon's Mines, the first Hollywood film made in Africa since 1931, was an extremely difficult film to make and was hampered by logistical challenges at every turn. From Africa, she headed straight to Italy to star in Quo Vadis, another Technicolor epic about the persecution of Christians in ancient Rome. From a certain perspective, Deborah was still a very successful actress. For example, according to TCM, Quo Vadis was the highest-grossing movie from MGM after Gone with the Wind at the time it was produced. But the roles just weren't there. Time and time again, she played decorative women, token love interests who observe from the sidelines while the men in their lives make the hard decisions and have the grand adventures. From Princess Flavia to Queen Bess, it was as if her personality had become gowns and tiaras. And even worse, the films undernourished her talent to the degree that they shook up the critics' confidence in her. Sure, she was compelling, but did they think too much of her back then? Was she really worth all that hype to begin with? She later said, "I felt the parts I was getting, and I suppose they were good enough parts, weren't giving me the chance to do what I enjoy doing, act." In the same article, she tells a story about taking her daughter to see King Solomon's Mines. When we came out, I asked her how she liked it. Oh, it was lovely, all the animals and all those dances, but why did you have to keep falling down and screaming all the time? I realized how true it was. I had just been playing women who, every time there was a crisis, fell down, screamed, or fainted. I figured there were plenty of girls with prettier faces who could do that as well as I, and who would like it better. Her rebellion in pursuit of greater roles was quiet and subtle. Nothing that would shake up the studio hierarchy or threaten larger systems, but that would prove vital to launching the next phase of her career. She switched agents. Deborah knew she needed a change, and boy, did she get it. In 1951, James Jones' novel From Here to Eternity hit bookshelves across America. The story follows a company of U.S. Army infantry stationed in Hawaii in the months leading up to the attack on Pearl Harbor. One storyline focuses on Karen Holmes, the wife of the company's commanding officer, who's known for having affairs with the men in her husband's unit. Tempted by her reputation, Sergeant Milt Warden pursues her for himself, and before you know it, the two fall passionately in love. The novel became enormously popular and eventually won the National Book Award, virtually guaranteeing that it would become a movie and it would be a cultural event. So, who would play the lecherous Mrs. Holmes? When the original choice for the role, Joan Crawford, backed out, the producers had to find someone to replace her, someone who could convey a complex inner life, someone a little bad, and more than anything, someone deeply sexy. No one could have anticipated who they ended up with.
I had just, at the time, I changed agents, and I went to a very marvelous man who's dead now called Bert Allenberg. And within, 2 weeks of my being what's known as under his banner, he called me up one day and he said, they're going to make From Here to Eternity at Columbia. And I said, yes. He said, have you read it? And so I said, no, of course. So he said, how about playing the part of Karen? I said, oh, come on, they're never going to think of me for that. And he said, well, I can try. So I waited all day for him to phone me in the evening because he'd gone to see Harry Cohn, this frightening monster of Columbia. And the phone rang in the evening. I picked it up and it was Bert, and I said, well, what? He said, you're right, they kicked me out of the office. I said, I told you not to go in there and make me a fool of me, you see. But he was a very clever man. All he did was go in there, make the suggestion, and leave. And Harry Cohn screamed, you've got to be crazy. Wah, 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 you know. The germ had been sown in his mind. And the next day, it worked. He called in his producer. He called in Fred Zinnemann, who was the director, and said, that crazy Allenberg has got a suggestion for her to play Karen, Deborah Kerr. And they both kind of went like that and said, well, of course.
And so Deborah Kerr was loaned from MGM to Columbia, which was an industry-wide surprise, a shock even. How would the woman who usually played teacup and lifted pinky ladies fare in the role of the super sexy captain's wife? It turns out, quite well. The Deborah Kerr in From Here to Eternity feels like a completely different person than the Deborah Kerr in, for example, The Prisoner of Zenda. To put it in terms we like to use today, she disappeared into the role. She spent months learning an American accent,
Well, if it isn't Sergeant Warden.
lending her voice a deeper and huskier tone. Karen doesn't glide like the ethereal goddesses she played at MGM. She glides like a viper through the grass, beautiful but dangerous, with anger, lust, and neuroticism simmering below the surface. And then, of course, there's the beach scene. The oft-parodied romp through the waves wasn't just risque in the context of Kerr's career, but in 1950s cinema generally. As Samuel Wigley wrote for BFI, on screen, Milton and Karen aren't exactly having sex as they do in the book, but for 1950s cinema-goers, they might as well have been. The orgiastic music, the thunder of the waves, trembling bodies, the looks of intent in their eyes. This was strong stuff for films of the time. The scene became one of the most iconic of the decade, and the film revitalized her career overnight.
Because of that one movie, everyone thought, oh, who's this? Had no idea that one could act.
Yes.
As Harvey Bright wrote in the New York Times, one had seen the change in the film From Here to Eternity. She was now a woman with a reservoir of deep flowing love, passionate and tender. The icicles have melted. Deborah continued this streak by originating the role of Laura Reynolds in Tea and Sympathy on Broadway, a play that, as film scholar David Gerstner writes, shot right for the heterosexual male jugular. At first glance, Laura seems like another of Deborah's ladylike roles. She's the wife of a football coach at a boys' prep school who tends to their home and provides the occasional tea and sympathy for the students. But as she begins to notice that one of the boys is ostracized and bullied because of his unconventional interests in classic music and sewing, and because he'd rather hang out with the moms than the other boys, she becomes invested in his well-being and eventually, gives him a hand. Rather than a simple tea-pouring caricature, Laura is explicitly depicted as having unfulfilled sexual needs and is squarely engaged in contemporary and somewhat controversial conversations about homosexuality and masculinity. She is a strong but flawed, fully developed character, certainly an interesting one to portray on the heels of Karen Holmes. Again, she earned rave reviews. Brooks Atkinson wrote in the New York Times, Miss Carr's performance as Laura is superb. Sympathetic without sentimentality, courageous without vindictiveness, is the perfect blend of beauty, evenness of temper, decision, and womanliness. One would think that this would be the perfect Oscar narrative, the underutilized talent who at long last finds success by leaving her home studio behind and trying something new. It's definitely one that worked for other actors. Why wouldn't it work for Deborah Kerr? After all, she was having one hell of a year. Well, the only thing was, so was Audrey Hepburn. Now, I made a video specifically about this race, so I won't get into too much detail here on Hepburn's journey. But basically, Hepburn began her career as a dancer and eventually turned to acting to earn a little money on the side. Like Deborah, she was noticed by the right producers at the right time and was asked to audition for a film called Roman Holiday. Based on the strength of her screen test alone, Paramount signed Audrey for the role, and the rest is history. She burst onto the scene and quickly became a major celebrity and fashion icon, differentiating herself from sex symbols like Marilyn Monroe and Ava Gardner with her thin frame and gamine looks. She had the sweetness and elegance that Deborah was also broadly known for, but a more innocent and wide-eyed demeanor, and 8 years Deborah's junior seemed well suited to the romantic comedies the industry was so interested in making. So yes, Deborah Kerr had an easy narrative, and yes, From Here to Eternity dominated Oscar night with 8 wins, including Best Picture. But Audrey Hepburn had something Deborah Kerr never did for American audiences, that big splashy introduction, simultaneously the hype, and the perfect film to justify it. As one journalist wrote, the real race is between Deborah Kerr and Audrey Hepburn. Offbeat casting is often a deciding element, and Miss Kerr switched her type from serene to sexy. But although meaty, her role wasn't the biggest or best in the picture. And side note, this is true. Her role is comparatively small and probably should have been categorized as supporting, but her co-star Donna Reed was and won that award instead. Anyway, Hollywood often rewards newcomers to films. Examples, Judy Holliday, Shirley Booth, Jennifer Jones, and Miss Hepburn scored an electric hit with her first starring role. Audrey swept nearly every award possible that year, including the Tony Award for Best Female Performance in a Play, which Deborah was also up for. Despite this loss, there was ample reason to celebrate. From Here to Eternity and Tea and Sympathy had proven that there were indeed better, more challenging parts waiting for her outside of MGM. So shortly after she received the offer to play Laura on Broadway, she requested and was granted a release from her MGM contract. She said, "I can't take the chance after From Here to Eternity. I hope I can get the kind of parts people haven't thought of me being in before. I hope I've bridged this whole thing." Now, having read many of Deborah's interviews from around this time, I guess I would describe her tone as a very polite version of those pictures of Nicole Kidman after she signed her divorce papers with Tom Cruise. Like, there's a palpable sense of elation in every sentence. She's not bitter toward MGM. In fact, she's quite tactful and complimentary of the studio. But she gives the impression that she clearly understands how profoundly this newfound freedom will affect her career for the better. And it absolutely did. What followed was a series of much more mature and complex roles that better reflected the diverse skill set she'd shown in England. One minute falling passionately in love with Van Johnson in The End of the Affair, the next rebuffing Robert Mitchum's advances as a nun in Heaven Knows Mr. Allison. One minute happily embracing her pupils in The King and I, the next terrified of them in The Innocents. Romance, adventure, musical, horror. The focus was once again on her talent. She was not simply a featured player in a spectacle, and thank God, because when she really gets to perform, it's a ton of fun to watch. Steve Weinberg wrote of her, "She goes right to the neurotic underpinnings of the character, but she offers them to us in quick, subtle changes of expression that flicker across her face like sunlight. She can feel theatrical at times, but an entire movie can rest on something as subtle as this, a small gesture that may look innocuous, but can mean the world within the context of the movie. If you've seen it, you know. Now today, I think most people still consider Deborah Kerr a stereotypically ladylike actress, and I don't think that's necessarily wrong. She still played ladylike characters after From Here to Eternity, albeit much better written ones. But I also think that description of her persona is a little simplistic. People often asked her about this perception, and every single time she always seemed a little disappointed, as if she were worried that it made her sound boring or something. For example, she once told a story about how a woman came up to her and said, "I'm the movie censor for my state, and I've never had to cut so much as a foot from one of your pictures." "Oh," Deborah protested, "how terribly dull." In another interview with Screenland, she said of her role in From Here to Eternity, "I'm no Marilyn Monroe, but I wish I were. This is my first undress role, and I wish I were Marilyn Monroe because I'd love to be able to get off the wonderful repartee that's always credited to her on the subject of sex." This quote stood out to me because having nearly completed her filmography over the past month, it seemed to describe a larger recurring theme in her work, which is a quiet yearning for sexual freedom. Deborah Kerr's characters are just as concerned with sex as more stereotypical sex symbols of the 1950s like Marilyn Monroe and Ava Gardner are. But her characters actively grapple with the external forces that repress them or complicate their feelings, whether that's the institution of marriage, societal conventions, or even her life's work. Her films don't focus purely on physical attraction, but on the neuroticism that accompanies that attraction and how adults navigate the sensitive social situations attraction causes. What does desire look like when it intrudes on gentility? When an isolated nun can't shake the memories of the boy she once loved? When a sensitive young woman can't handle the news that her crush may not be the good man she'd assumed? When she can't quite tame either the man she loves or his jealous daughter? The ladylike veneer is always there. The pearls, the corsets, the posture, the accent. But the veneer always masks an undercurrent of passion that wants to burst forth and is always dangerously close to doing so. Kerr continued pursuing these types of roles into the 1960s. Her final 2 films in particular deal with this from the perspective of older women who've been trapped in loveless marriages. I mean, hell, Deborah does a topless sex scene with Burt Lancaster in The Gypsy Moths. That's right, I can't even show you a Deborah Kerr scene because it's too explicit for YouTube. Is it a particularly erotic or lewd scene? Of course not, and she does use a body double for part of it. But it's worth noting that she was the one who took that role. That scene is part of her persona, not Ava Gardner's, not Marilyn Monroe's, not Elizabeth Taylor, Joan Crawford, or Lana Turner. None of them ever did that. Despite all of this, the idea of Deborah Kerr as simply a refined lady has largely stuck, and I think it's worth asking why. Part of it is the strength of MGM's early publicity push. As Screenland wrote upon the release of Separate Tables, it is undeniably true that the portrait of Miss Kerr as a lady without a sign of fleshly yearnings was created largely by the kind of pictures she was tossed into when she first arrived from England. Part of it is something about Deborah herself.
It's a very curious thing, I suppose. It's a mixture of the first impressions and something innate in me that I'm perhaps not even aware of myself, that, as I've said before, comes through on that camera. And you can't do anything about that. You can't change it.
On that same note, People magazine once rehashed an old Hollywood joke about her. Deborah Kerr is the sort of creature who could be photographed ambling disheveled out of a place of assignation or doing the hully-gully naked on the Golden Gate Bridge and draw no more comment from the public than "lovely girl." And frankly, part of it is because she did continue to have roles like that. The more buttoned up they were, the more the Academy generally tended to notice. In 1956, she was nominated for The King and I, not the film adaptation of Tea and Sympathy. In 1957, she was nominated for Heaven Knows Mr. Allison, not An Affair to Remember. In 1958, she was nominated for Separate Tables, not Bonjour Tristesse. That award, which I won't get into too much here because she needs her own video, went to Susan Hayward, who, like Deborah, had racked up enough awards that a career win was in order. In other words, Hollywood latched on to Deborah's more accessible work, the work that more accurately fit the preconceived notions of her persona. And this tracks pretty accurately with the other side of the spectrum. Women strictly typed as sex symbols had a hard time racking up nominations. Lana Turner and Ava Gardner each had 1, and some were never nominated at all. Rita Hayworth and Marilyn Monroe, for example. The exceptions being Elizabeth Taylor and Sophia Loren, although I think there are some other factors at play there. Isn't it ironic, then, that women famous for sexual scandals won Oscars in those same years? Of her 6 nominations, the role for which she probably should have, and more than likely could have won under different circumstances, was for Anna in the film adaptation of Rodgers and Hammerstein's musical, The King and I. What's interesting about this nomination is that it echoes a race that famously later played out very differently. If you saw my video about Julie Andrews' 1964 Oscar win, you're probably aware of the lip-syncing scandal that sank Audrey Hepburn's Oscar chances for My Fair Lady. To neatly sum it up, Jack Warner cast Audrey Hepburn as Eliza Doolittle instead of Julie Andrews, who had originated the role on Broadway. Audrey tried to sing the role, but she really couldn't because it's an extremely challenging one, even for trained singers, so the studio replaced her voice with Marni Nixon's. Now, dubbing was not a taboo practice in the 1950s and early 60s, although it was largely kept under wraps by the studios. They believed that if audiences were to discover that stars weren't actually singing in their films, their illusions of perfection would shatter, and people wouldn't be as interested in seeing them in musical extravaganzas anymore. So people like Marni Nixon were hired and signed to contracts that forbade them from publicly taking credit or talking about their role in the film. So when the news about Audrey's dubbing got out, the studio very sloppily addressed it. Audiences threw their allegiance behind Julie Andrews, who they believed should have gotten the role instead, and Audrey was basically thrown under the bus. Okay, now rewind 8 years, and we have Deborah Kerr, who, like Audrey, was not a trained singer. She took lessons to prepare for the role, but she knew she couldn't really sing the way she'd need to play Anna. So rather than wait, she brought in Marni very early in the process as a collaborator.
She was in much agreement with the fact that she needed to be dubbed, and we worked a week per song before we even recorded them, and then it was her job to then mouth to that recording. So we were quite together, and I knew every little movement. We rehearsed on the sound stage with the rehearsal stage with the furniture all laid out, and just rehearsed side by side till we got a blend, and she could approve of that.
You can tell Deborah's voice is mixed in the final soundtrack, but it's clear that learning each other's voices really paid off. It's a much more convincing mix than any of Marni's dubbing work on West Side Story or My Fair Lady. Sometimes I genuinely can't tell where Deborah stops and Marni begins. And on the press tour, Deborah was eager to share credit for this performance. Truly, you can find article after article of her literally just complimenting Marni.
She went here to Earl Wilson and gave an interview, and the head of the headline was Deborah Tells a Secret. And I said to her, look, the people aren't supposed to know that I did your dubbing. And she said, well, I don't have to know that that's in your contract. I mean, she was that gracious. She was wonderful.
Her openness and positivity about the collaboration wasn't just kind, it also meant that critics could see the performance for what it really was, with no surprises. And there was no question, her physical performance of the songs merited recognition. For someone who was not trained in musical theater and who had never been in a movie musical, Deborah acted her songs really well, seamlessly perfecting a brand new genre. Even Bosley Crowther gave her a stunning review, writing that Miss Kerr matches Yul Brynner boldly. Her beauty, her spirit, and her English style come as close to approximating those of the late Gertrude Lawrence, the original Anna, as could be. And the voice of Marni Nixon adds a thrilling lyricism to her songs. The point of the story, as all know, is that you should never underestimate a woman's power. Miss Kerr makes it trenchant and enjoyable. Once again, you'd think there'd be an easy narrative there. A woman largely untrained in musical theater who goes toe-to-toe with and holds her own with the man who originated the role on Broadway and ends up giving a performance that leads to the 4th highest grossing film of the year and rave reviews. And once again, there was an easier narrative elsewhere. In 1956, Ingrid Bergman starred in an American film for the first time in 7 years after being exiled to Europe when her affair with Roberto Rossellini was revealed. In that time, the American public had come around to Ingrid, and the embrace of her film Anastasia was seen as redemption. The once beloved star had finally come home. Anastasia is not a great film, but it and Ingrid's return were literally the only thing anyone was talking about come Oscar night. Unsurprisingly, she won, and Deborah's arc didn't really matter.
So in many ways, I have to thank the thief for creating my most profound piece of work to date. A woman robbed.
This is not the only time extraordinary circumstances in the personal life of a star affected the Best Actress race for Deborah. In 1961, she earned her final Oscar nomination for The Sundowners, a film about a nomadic sheep-herding family in the Australian outback. Her fellow nominee that night for her performance in Butterfield 8 was Elizabeth Taylor. Elizabeth had, like Deborah, been nominated several times for Best Actress by that point, but had yet to win. Many believe that her losses were less a consequence of her acting skill and more a consequence of her tumultuous personal life. When Taylor began an affair with Eddie Fisher, she was blamed for breaking up his seemingly perfect marriage with America's sweetheart Debbie Reynolds, and unsurprisingly received a ton of backlash for that. But while in Italy filming Cleopatra, Elizabeth nearly died from pneumonia and required an emergency tracheotomy to survive right before Oscar voting started. Again, Butterfield 8 isn't one of Elizabeth Taylor's best performances, and even she would say that. But the tracheotomy was exactly the kind of freak incident that the Academy ate up. Another redemptive arc for a woman scorned. Deborah would say later in life that she believed of her losses, The Sundowners was the one she should have won for. I understand why she likes the role of the gritty Australian, another accent by the way, but I'm not convinced that she ever really had a realistic chance that year. Most contemporary articles cite Shirley MacLaine as the clear runner-up for her performance in The Apartment. Still, that was Deborah's last shot at a competitive Oscar. It probably shouldn't have been. If the Academy ever gave horror the light of day, they might have recognized her sensational performance in 1961's The Innocents, an adaptation of Henry James's Turn of the Screw. Cinematographer Robert Surtees once said of Deborah, "She acts with her eyes more than anyone else I've ever worked with." And I think this film is the perfect film to understand what he means. Even when physically doing very little, she achieves so much. Pauline Kael wrote of the film, "Maybe Deborah Kerr's performance should really be called great, as modulated and controlled and as flamboyant as almost anything you'd see on the stage. And it's a tribute to Miss Kerr's beauty and dramatic powers that after 20 years in the movies, years of constant overexposure, she is more exciting than ever. Perhaps she is a demon." The 60s are an underrated era for her. Night of the Iguana, anyone? But there is a noticeable shift in the types of films she does for two major reasons. One, she turned 40, and we start to see her in much more lighthearted roles that essentially parody her work in the 1950s and mock the increasingly old-fashioned ladylike persona. So, for example, Prudence and the Pill riffs on the restless, sex-starved housewife by turning her into a blasé woman so stuffy that even her long-term affair doesn't seem torrid or exciting. This is also a consequence of, too, the radical shift in American culture. Although the 1960s were an incredibly Anglophilic decade, with British bands, stories, and actors becoming immensely popular in the United States, the movement was propelled by youth culture, by rebellion and sexual revolution. This new decade was difficult for her type generally. Audrey Hepburn took a more serious track before softly retiring. Julie Andrews, who in many ways could be thought of as the natural successor of the Greer-Deborah pipeline, also had trouble fitting into the zeitgeist beyond family-centric vehicles. This would only worsen as the 1970s inched closer, as glamour gave way to realism and the sexual revolution ushered in new standards. Kerr's specific brand of adult drama and performance style became harder and harder to sell. Just a handful of women who had the same level of prominence she'd had in the 40s and 50s were still acting in major motion pictures. Many had turned to so-called hag horror to prolong their careers. And while some found dignity in that work, no matter the genre, Deborah Kerr felt she'd be better off if she just bowed out. After she received a script that would have required her to castrate a pig, she quietly retired from the screen, only to be lured back for the occasional TV movie. Never one to complain or be bitter, Kerr told the Chicago Tribune in 1986 that she wasn't disappointed by being overlooked at the Academy Awards. Quite the opposite, in fact, as I'm sure I've had more mileage out of it than if I'd won the damn thing, she said. Can you remember who won 2 years ago? Or 4? No, but people always remember my Oscar record, and they also point out what good company I'm keeping. What with Chaplin, Garbo, Judy Garland, Fred Astaire. In 1994, in part, I'm sure, inspired by the revival and popularity of An Affair to Remember by Sleepless in Seattle, the Academy remedied its oversight and awarded Deborah with an honorary Oscar. And who better to bestow upon her a much-deserved, far too late award that symbolized a career of underappreciated genius than Glenn Close. Deborah Kerr's legacy is a hard one to pin down. For someone so omnipresent in American cinema for almost 20 years, it's kind of surprising how little she comes up when people talk about their favorite actors of this era. The way we talk about stars and recontextualize or read their work as a reflection of their personal lives has meant that Deborah Kerr kind of gets left behind in a lot of conversations. As Donald Chase explains in Film Comment, Kerr's characteristic on-screen subtlety and self-effacement were mirrored by a low press profile, so she was never an object of obsession. She rarely leapt unbidden into the mind when you weren't actually watching her. So think about when a new Bennifer yacht picture surfaces. It's easy to make the connection to Elizabeth Taylor and Richard Burton, to fall into another YouTube rabbit hole and think about her absurd level of fame. With Deborah, a woman whose fame never became a part of her persona, who never scandalized the nation, who never needed a redemptive arc, there is only the work. There is only the appreciation of a great actress and her great films. It's probably not surprising to hear this after this very long video, but I'm a big fan of Deborah Kerr. Like, Rita Wilson in Sleepless in Seattle is me.
Are you alright?
She's fine.
So I hope this video has persuaded you to check out her work, a good chunk of which is currently streaming on the Criterion Channel. Be sure to head over to my Instagram and TikTok. Yes, I have a TikTok now, where I'll be posting more content I found in the making of this video, as well as some of my personal recommendations for Kerr films to watch. Thank you again to the sponsor of this video, NordPass. Not long ago, I was scrolling on Instagram and one of the accounts I follow posted a story about how she hadn't been on the app recently because she'd been hacked. The guy basically locked up her account and said, "Hey, I'm not giving it back to you until you pay me $50. Relatively harmless compared to the millions of dollars of damage ransomware hackers cause in the United States every year, but still a bad experience nonetheless. The whole thing sufficiently freaked me out enough that right then and there, I decided to shore up all my cybersecurity defenses. Now, I know I'm not the only one who once upon a time used the same password over and over out of convenience. Well, that's not good, folks. The absolute easiest thing you can do to secure your accounts is to make sure that you have a complex password. That's why I downloaded NordPass. Brought to you by the cybersecurity experts who built NordVPN, NordPass is an app that helps you generate, manage, and use secure passwords. If you're signing up for an account on a new site, NordPass's password generator will create a complex password for you on the spot. But don't worry, there's no need to memorize like $RT90L hashtag or anything like that, because all of your passwords are stored together in one place, a private vault that you can access anytime from desktop or mobile, just by remembering one master password. Once you've stored your password, NordPass will autofill it on that website the next time you use it with just one click, so you don't have to scroll through hundreds of passwords to find the right one. It's such an easy process, one that has helped me keep track of the accounts I have and whether or not they're secure. Gone are the days of using your pet's name as a password. Let NordPass do the work. Go to nordpass.com/BeKindRewind by clicking the link in the description below and use the code BeKindRewind to get 50% off a 2-year NordPass premium plan plus 4 free months. That's nordpass.com/BeKindRewind with code BeKindRewind.